Morning everyone, and thank you again for coming on time. Very, very grateful that you got up early this morning. This morning we're going to consider the question, can behavioural insights contribute to our understanding of what matters most to families in the 21st century? My two panellists here with us today are Sam Hannah-Rankin. She's the Director of the Public Sector Innovation for the Department of Premier and Cabinet here in Victoria. And Nicholas Gruen, who you met yesterday. Nicholas is the CEO of Lateral Economics. Before we hear from both of those people, I'm going to show you a pre-recorded interview with Dr David Halpern. He's the CEO of the Nudge Unit in the UK, or the Behavioural Insights team, and the What Works advisor to the UK government. He was booked to be a keynote at this conference, but sadly had to pull out at the last minute. And I caught up with him when he was in Australia about a month ago and asked him a few questions.
So behavioural insights approaches have generally brought into government, and are doing so very strongly, this sort of more empirical approaches. They both help us to understand actually the barriers we ourselves as policymakers and professionals are subject to the same biases and frankly what's called overconfidence. We think we know what works. In fact, by the way, the more senior we become, the more overconfident we become. So it helps us to understand some of the barriers, but it also provides lots of very concrete examples of these more empirical approaches. Because alongside any kind of big program, we're going to have this big welfare program or childcare program, there are loads of other supplementary questions. Well, how can we get the turnout rate to increase? What would be a more effective way of giving feedback? There are all these what seem like smaller questions which we can empirically test and say, well, is this version more effective than the other? Often using randomized controlled trials or multi-arm methods. And this has helped to sort of smuggle into governments and policy professionals across the world actually a very strong empirical approach. And it may well be that when we look back on it historically, we'll say maybe the most useful thing that behavioral science brought in was not just a better model of human behavior, but it brought in a much more empirical approach to policy, and that's incredibly valuable. So it's a really good question. Why is it, what's getting in the way of experimenting now? If it seems such an obvious thing to do, surely we want to find out what works. Well, it hits a number of barriers. So one of which is that a lot of lawyers and others will pop up and say, well, no, everyone should be treated the same. Of course, that's an interesting idea, and it makes sense until you think about, well, we can treat everyone the same, but we don't know whether we're harming them or not. Sometimes it looks complicated because it looks like, well, randomized controlled trials all sound a bit technical, etc. Well, actually, it's not the maths or the methods that's the difficult thing. It's other barriers. So if you're a minister, do you really, really want to know whether your flagship program didn't work? Maybe not. But it's easier to say, well, look, minister, why don't we try several versions of your great idea and see what's most effective? But the fundamental starting point is humility, which is to realize that quite often we don't know what works. In fact, we don't even know the thing that we're doing already works. And in some ways, even worse than that, which is the voice in our head is very inclined to tell us, of course what you're doing is effective. I mean, it's very hard to think as a parent or professional, this thing which you might have been doing for years might not be the most effective approach. So that is the most difficult step, I think, is to say we might not know what works. It's deep kind of humility to say, open ourselves to the possibility there might be a better way of doing this. That's the most important step, not the kind of fancy randomization or the methods around it. So look, as most parents and frankly young people will be aware of, we live in a whole different world of technology. And it brings lots of positive assets and ability to express your identity and so on, but it's clearly bringing in some issues as well. So the technology is using massive amounts of data and machine learning to capture our attention. And so you might go on your Facebook feed, or your kid might be on it, and suddenly they'll find themselves they spent 2 or 3 hours on it. There are real concerns we have. In North America, we've seen the increase, particularly in teenage girls, of self-harm increased nearly 3-fold now, since specifically 2009, it suddenly picks up. In Britain, it picks up from 2011, 2 years later. We're now at 2-fold the increase of self-harm in teenage girls. What's it about? Well, we can't be completely sure, but the smoking gun certainly points to social media, and particularly platforms such as Instagram, which are driving quite aggressive kind of comparison and so on. But we're not defenseless in this situation. And one of the very powerful things we can do is a great bit of work done by the Royal Society of Public Health in Britain with 1,500 young people. asking them and studying the impact. And you can see some media platforms, such as YouTube, it might take a lot of sleep because you're spending too much time watching these videos, but it doesn't seem to have the same mood effects, negative mood effects, as Instagram. Well, it's very powerful to get this information out and about, and that starts to put real pressure on the big social media platforms to change what they do, to have more effective controls that young people can use. And the last thing I do think very strongly, and in fact there's been this fantastic deliberative forum which Behavioural Insights team have done with the Fairfax Foundation, with young people here in actually New South Wales, and getting them together and talking about, well, how are they using social media and how is it evolving? And we hear a whole new lexicon of things which I've never heard of myself, like floppy swappies. Don't look them up on your worktop laptop. But also young people talking about how they're using these platforms and how they would like to be given control back. So very powerful to reintroduce their voice into kind of the discussion and then say, put that pressure back on the social media platforms and say, this is what our young people are saying they want. You need to deliver it to them. So one of the things that Behavioural Insights, I think, has shown us, maybe rather helpfully, is that quite often it's not just about the individual behaviour. Of course, that's part of it. You know, we're trying to, in a world where we've got rising obesity levels in our kids and frankly in our adults too, well, is that your fault? Is that the fault of parents and so on, which was often said historically, you know, why don't you work on it harder? It's just the sheer forces of other kind of pressures on our behaviour. So you go to the supermarket, you try and make great effort to choose more healthy options, but then you're confronted by all these kind of cartoon characters, lots of other things influencing. Even if you manage to get through the supermarket, you did pretty good, you then get to the checkout and you hit a wall of Tim Tams. It's very hard not to put one into your, into your trolley and so on. So this isn't just about individual behaviour, it's about sometimes called the obesogenic environment around us influencing our behaviour. So Behavioural Insights is not just about the individual. How can you make a diet more effective? How can you make someone commit? Of course it's about that too, but it's about changing the equilibrium of whole markets. So we've done a lot of work, in fact we just released a load of stuff further in the UK, which is basically driving reformulation of food products. Not least, in fact, sugar taxes. Sugar taxes aren't to change individual behaviour, they're to change the behaviour of producers to reduce the sugar content in drinks. In Britain, in the last 2 years, we've got 11% reduction in sugar by using these techniques in our drinks for our kids and so on. So it's very, very much about trying to change the equilibrium too. And just to put one idea in your mind, I think is very powerful, is to say, don't just think about in a supermarket, what's the individual level, but how can you put pressure back on your retailers? So how can you organize, for example, almost you could get parents or whatever to do it and say, well, why don't you rate your supermarket by what's the special offers on? Is it on healthy or unhealthy foods? What's on the end of your aisles? Healthy or unhealthy? What's by the checkouts? Healthy or unhealthy? And then choose your supermarket before you even walk in the door as one which is likely to prompt you to healthier options, and put that out there to put the pressure on your big chains to actually use all their skills and abilities to prompt healthier choices. So you're trying to make it easier for the parent, easier for the child to make healthy choices. You don't put it all back on the individual. So, what can we use? What can we learn from this? Well, there's two kind of things. In terms of behavioral science, in fact, you might find it helpful as a sort of framework. We sometimes, the Behavioural Insight team, use this very simple framework. It's called EAST. If you want to affect human behaviour, you try to think about making it easy, attractive, social, and timely. So these are techniques which you can use in many areas. So we should be obsessed about making it easier for people to achieve what they're trying to do. How do we take out the friction, as it's so called? So that can be, well, why do I have to call this person? Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to fill in the following form? How much of that can you take away? And you'll often find that very, very effective in relation to take-up. It's been terribly neglected by policymakers. Be obsessed about how easy can you make it for the person. Take away those barriers. Attractive, well, that can be financial incentives, but it can be lots of other things too. So, for example, we ran a scheme where to try and encourage people to take certain kinds of good quality childcare arrangement, but actually to do it in couples, in two people. So two mothers, for example, actually if they both turn up a certain number of times, then actually they get an extra kind of present or reward. So you're making it attractive in some other kind of way. Other kinds of attractiveness is use people's name when you make them an invitation. To get someone to turn up for a job appointment, we found you could get nearly a threefold increase if instead of just sending them a standard text, you use their name and you say, dear Anne, blah, blah, blah. I've booked you a place, good luck, David. 3-time increase, roughly, so make it attractive. Social, we're incredibly influenced by what other people are doing. So you can see that's why people put it on books, on videos, everything else. This is how many people are doing the following thing. We're very influenced by not what we're told to do, the order, this is the rule, but what's everyone else doing? So that's a very, very powerful force, and some of the most interesting interventions are also about mobilizing people's social networks, such as around a young person. And the T is the timely. So in general, there are certain moments when we can be open to persuasion or change in our behavior. And actually, most of the time, we're not. We're too busy, our brains are shut down doing lots of other things and all the demands on our time. So in fact, a famous, even notorious example in America was how retailers would work out if you're pregnant. Actually, why is pregnancy incredibly interesting to retailers? It's because it's going to disrupt your life in all kinds of ways. So that's the moment in which you can try and get someone to switch products, retailers, etc. So you look for these moments of disruption, which of course often a lot of family lives hinges around some of those, and they are the moments within which you can try and help and support someone to make a different life choice. So the good news is there is a whole body of really quite interesting interventions that are building up around using these techniques, which can be used by parents, by professionals, and so on. The other big lesson that comes from the work is that we really need to be more empirical, more literally experimental. So for policymakers, it means do policy in a different way. Don't just go for the national rollout. Think, well, why don't we test deliberate variations in the approach to see what's more or less effective? For public service professionals, it means open-minded to what else is the evidence out there. It can also mean building of what work centers, or maybe that's what, of course, you have in this particular case too, to try and build the evidence and put it in easy hands. And then ultimately, that's also true for parents and others. Ask the question. If you're going to go to your doctor and you've got a rash, you might look up online before and find out about it. We need to try and put in the hands of citizens themselves what's more or less effective and have them ask the questions back, be inquisitive and press. What is the evidence behind that? And that's one of the most powerful forces that might ultimately change the game, so that we try and build, not just good practice for today, but we're trying to build better practice for tomorrow and build up the evidence base.
I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, and paying my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders of any other communities that might be here with us today. So I'd like to talk about the utility of behavioural insights in terms of contributing to thinking about how we can best service and support families' well-being. There are sort of 3 aspects to this, I think, and the first one is that behavioural insights really contributes to our understanding of how we can change or help to influence family behaviours. Behavioural insights is, as everyone has been talking about to this point, really about how human beings make decisions. And so when we're talking about how we work with families and how we can influence them, families are groups of human beings who are living in very close proximity to each other and are hugely reliant on each other for positive outcomes. So there's no doubt that you can apply behavioural insights in that context. And one example that I really think is powerful and probably not considered most frequently is this whole concept of scarcity mindset, which this idea that when you don't have enough of something, and this is for families and every human being has been proved in many different situations, when you don't have enough of something, your ability to make decisions is actually impaired. So if you think about the last time when you had a critical work deadline that was really important, were you patient with your partner and your kids? Mm-hmm. Were you able to sleep peacefully? Were you able to consider your options calmly? Chances not so much. And this lack of time created anxiety, which impairs your mental bandwidth, right? This idea of how much attention you have to give to things, how much cognition you have, how much self-control you have. And behavioural research has shown that scarcity mindset can really heavily impair decision-making for people living in poverty, for instance. People in poverty have their mental bandwidth effectively absorbed by the stress and mechanics of survival. They have less ability to plan and make sensible decisions, less willpower to manage impulsive behaviour, and their capacity is actually consumed by their immediate need to feed their family and pay rent. Understanding this kind of concept and these kind of ideas helps us better design policy and practice that can actually support families who are living in poverty or under other types of stress. We can think about how to make services simpler, access easier, and how to make long-term opportunities more attainable in a way that recognises the lack of bandwidth that families might be experiencing. Behavioural insights also contributes to our understanding of how we can change the system. So I think, and you'll have seen this in David's discussion, behavioural insights is often thought of as, very empirical, these ideas of nudges and randomised control trials. And there are certainly plenty of opportunities for these kind of practices in all aspects of family policy. But there's also extraordinary opportunities in leveraging qualitative aspects of behavioural insights for broader systemic change. So many of you would be aware how, in the wake of several horrible tragedies and missed opportunities, the Royal Commission for Family Violence recommended a broad reform of the information sharing regime in the family violence system here in Victoria. This prompted a range of initiatives across government and the public sector around legislative reform, around operational redesign, new technology platforms. We have the Behavioural Insights unit in the Department of Premier and Cabinet here in Victoria, and we saw the opportunity to introduce a new perspective to all of this work. Namely, how do frontline workers actually decide whether to share information? What makes them consciously or subconsciously choose to share or not share? So after 270 hours of ethnographic research at 4 courts and 1 service provider, along with a deep literature review and an interrogation of Royal Commission testimonies, we found a number of interesting insights. And there are just 2 that I personally think are great favourites that really would inform how you might design legislation, operation, and technology altogether. One thing is as simple as thinking about how the operating environment can affect how and whether workers share information. Something as simple as positioning a court worker where they're visible in the court to visiting police, as opposed to behind a closed door, can encourage information sharing just by making engagement easy, building social connections and a level of trust. Another interesting finder is that workers are deeply committed to empowering the victim survivors they're working with. Intuitively, we know that. But the interesting ramification then is when you talk about consent around information sharing, and whether it's legislated or not, many workers will actually seek victim survivors' consent to share information, even if it's not legally required, because they want to empower the victim survivors and give them a stronger feeling of control over their own life. These and many other insights from that report are being used to inform broader system reform, the development of the information sharing legislation, the design of the operational support hubs, and the simplification of decision-making processes for the support of frontline workers. Behavioural insights can provide both policy and practice with an understanding of human decision-making that can inform design and development. Behavioural insights is very much more powerful than just nudges and randomised control trials. Finally, behavioural insights actually contributes to our understanding of how we can better manage our own decision-making as policymakers and practitioners. I'm guessing that pretty much everyone in the room is a decision-maker in some aspect of family policy and practice. But I know that you're all human and therefore have all the same biases and use the same heuristics that other humans do. There's famous statistics about how 80% of us think we're above average drivers and above average intelligence. We put off doing our tax return, even though it's arguably more important than the next episode of The Handmaid's Tale. Close call. But these behavioural quirks that we kind of quite happily acknowledge in our personal life also affect decisions, how we make decisions in our work, how we frame issues, how we interact with colleagues and stakeholders. And we need to have the humility to understand that as policymakers and practitioners, we're not just working on people, we're working on ourselves. And I think that's a very powerful contributor that behavioural insights can make. As a closing note, though, around behavioural insights, I think it's really important to put it into perspective. Government works in very complex and multifaceted areas, and family well-being is no exception. The challenge is that opportunities to create impact in complex spaces do not respect the boundaries of any single discipline. We should be looking for positive impact for the people that we serve, not methodological purity. In this context, and I should define there, when I'm saying methodological purity, I don't mean rigour, I mean adherence to methodology over impact. In this context, behavioural insights is one of many disciplines that should be used to deliver better policy and practice. And as policymakers and practitioners, we need to figure out how we can integrate all of these new approaches across discipline silos to achieve the best outcomes. We need to see behavioural insights for what it is, a critical and valuable addition to the way we develop policy and service design delivery, but absolutely not an end in itself. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Nicholas?
And thanks, Anne. Look, I'll make a few brief remarks. We're really talking about evidence-based policy, and the most significant word for me, anyway, that David used, he used right at the beginning, and the word was smuggle. So, Behavioural Insights Unit, and absolute credit to David Halpern, one of the people in the world, a bit like, this may be a bit over the top, but that guy who, invented microcredit, what's his name, got a Nobel Prize. Mohammed Yunus. I mean, David Halpern took a sort of simple, compelling, bleedingly obvious idea and sold it by turning it into a thing. And the thing is, hey, well, all those things he said to us. If you're going to have a national program, why don't you roll it out slowly and learn as you go? Why don't you vary things? Just everything he said. So it's sort of important to reflect on the fact that I use the word fad because it sounds negative, and I mean it negatively, and I also mean it positively. He thingized it. He turned it into a thing. It's been turned into a thing, and I would like to think it's sort of important to deconstruct that, because fads have their day and they become new orthodoxies. And we've got a couple of big fads going on, and they're both great. Behavioural Insights is one. RCTs, slightly, I mean, you can say that's absorbed into behavioural economics, but, behavioural insights. But when David Halpern talks about RCTs, he's actually not talking about, most of the time, all singing, all dancing, $200,000-$300,000 randomised controlled trials. He's talking about A/B testing, which is much more to be embraced and welcomed into what we do than randomised controlled trials, which certainly shouldn't be, they're not bad things, but they're big, they're clunky, and they end up giving you a big yes-no answer to something, and then you don't know what to do with it because, well, we're in a different city, so will it work here? Or we're using a somewhat different methodology over in this part of the program, and so what does the randomised control trial mean for us? Why am I hanging on to these negative thoughts? Because I would hope that out of behavioural insights, out of this turn towards evidence, that grows into a movement which gets stronger, more thoughtful, more embedded, and everything that David Halpern's doing in the United Kingdom and around the world gives me a lot of confidence. I think he's great. I think this whole thing is great. But it's still being marketed as a thing. Maybe it just always has to be, and my preferences should just be kept as I can just be the sort of bad uncle waving his finger in the background, if you like. But for me, it's very important for us to learn to do things on the merits, not because we read them in a book, but because we read a whole lot of things in a book and we solved a problem on its merits. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Oh, well, let me just take off from that point, because I think it is seen as a fad often in our field, and quite a lot of cynicism in academia about it, and And yet there are some very compelling pieces of wisdom in what we've heard this morning. I think everyone would agree. So in a way, I wonder whether David's ability to make it a thing has kind of become the problem now. And I'm wondering whether, do you see a time when the use of the learnings from behavioural sciences, I tend to think of it more as behavioural sciences.
Well, sure.
That the learnings from the behavioural sciences, the knowledge, the quite a large evidence base that we have there, whether that will become more of a mainstream element of how we do family policy. Then at the moment, one of the criticisms is that we've got these units, the BI units. Sorry,
Exactly.
Sam,
Oh,
but
pointing
I'm pointing
fingers
to you.
No,
But
it's true.
I've had it said to me, why are there these units everywhere, and what's so special? And they do this secret stuff, and it's all very mysterious. Do you ever see that it's going to become more mainstream?
Look, absolutely, and I mean, it's interesting. Our Behavioural Insights unit in Victoria was set up a couple of years ago, and we were in quite a privileged position in that it was set up within a pre-existing space within the public sector reform context and within public sector innovation, which is another wanky word, but really means actually how do we create value in bringing new ways of working into government. It's kind of that simple. And it's something that everyone should be aspiring to, and Behavioural Insights came into that context, and the unit was built as an attempt to try and build greater competency and capability across the Victorian Public Service, so that, because I mean the logic of using human psychology and like how is this not being used in our policy and practice? It's actually I think fundamentally wrong that it's not actually being used as part. As you say, there's a substantial evidence base around it. It absolutely should be integrated.
So do you think you'll do yourself out of a job one day?
Oh, hopefully. Like hopefully, the behavioural insight stuff, the way that we look at it is that it's there to show people that something is happening and that it exists as a thing in government. But what we do is work with people where the problems are, right? And
Yeah. Nick?
Yeah, so I've got a fairly different take on that. I guess I'm peddling my own idea, which is what one particular institutional model into which this sort of thing could grow, and I spoke briefly about it with regard to I spoke about an evaluator general yesterday. I'm highly suspicious that this resource that is being built to be available to public servants and to the public service will be used on its merits, because most of what a great deal of what the public service do is to service their ministers in performing government. And performing government is reassuring people, having the appearance of being in control, and so on. One of the expressions that struck me when I first started chairing TAXI, the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, is that they use the word hunch. Well, you just can't use the word hunch in a press conference in government. Just can't do it. The minister can't do it. Permanent head can't do it. We're all role-playing. We're all reassuring everyone all the time. And that's the dominant cultural practice in the public service.
So you're sceptical. You don't agree with Sam that this could become mainstream.
Well, I
in the
want
future.
it to become. I think we share an aspiration for what it might become, and it's not much. I mean, I don't think there's much value in us each trying to predict the future, and we'll have somewhat different ideas. I have a strong idea of what would get in the way of this becoming really normal. Mm-hmm. And I've tried to build an institution which might give us some chance. So the idea is that in government you have the ministerially directed executive, that's the public service, delivering services and advising ministers. And then you have another part of the executive, which I call the independent executive, which is the Auditor General, the courts, the Productivity Commission, the Parliamentary Budget Office. These organisations do not report to ministers, are not responsible for making things appear like everything's fine. They're there to show us the facts. So what I want to do, so this idea of the Evaluator General isn't just to have an evaluator which is on par with the Auditor General sitting at the top, but to try to actually bring this distinction between the independent executive and the ministerially directed executive down to working in the field, so that when we're delivering something, a few officers of the Evaluator General are helping build monitoring evaluation systems. That data is built principally to improve the self-transparency of the people delivering the service, but then goes up in two directions, to the agency delivering the service, to the Evaluator General, and then to the public. That's the kind of thing that can build the institutional sinews of actually being able to, for Sam to be able, for the system to be on Sam's side, rather than the side of the person who's about to give a press conference and say everything's good, the government's doing a good job.
So what you're describing is a mechanism. You're not saying that behavioural insights are useless, but we don't have a mechanism to ensure that actually something happens.
At the moment, we have the institutional structure of it as a fad, and the big question is, can we grow it into... Sorry, I really don't want to be rude about that.
That's fine. I think we get your point.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leap off that point and throw to you guys, for you might have a view on that, or so is there anyone that has a view on that, or would you like to take it in another direction? Brit, we're bringing you a microphone. Could you say who you are when you start? Thank you.
Bridget Phillips from the University of...
Close to your mouth.
University of Huddersfield. The 2 points I just wanted to make. One is about why, for example, the first point is the idea of a government having a nudge unit. People go, what are they up to now? What are they trying to get us to do? This is all kind of secret squirrel psychology, and they're kind of trying to manipulate us. But so that's really important in terms of kind of perception. But the second thing, Sam, what I was really struck by what you were saying was, you were talking... The problem is with rolling it all into one thing, because one of the things you were talking about, which I have a really, really big interest in, is good quality system design. Yeah. So where you place workers, who they're beside, who they're not beside, how close are they to families. We've had these terrible examples of workers being placed in city centre offices in like call centres, miles away from the families they work with. And then the second thing you talked about, which is really crucial to child protection reasoning, is how people reason, the errors in human reasoning and communication. So both those things are really valuable things, but when they're rolled into one thing that the government's promoting.
Yeah, and I think this is slightly different around how we've kind of approached the behavioural insights thing. Yeah. Is we actually haven't, in Victoria, we haven't gone out and said, hey, we're the behavioural insights unit, this is where we are. Yeah. What we have been doing is working with departments in their problem spaces and bringing behavioural insights aspects to the problems at hand. So absolutely, are we running, randomised control trials where we're changing tax forms and, playing with, all of these kind of SMS reminders and all of those things. And and I'm not undermining the value of those opportunities, but I think the power of what we're talking about is, like you say, actually bringing this competency around understanding how humans behave into the problem space. And it's less around let's go run a randomised control trial and more around how do we work with helping the people who are designing the policy to understand how do we find intervention points in the system where we can help the people who are practicing and implementing policy on a day-to-day basis work better to support the people. And that point around the government trying to influence people's decisions, we do it at the moment all the time. We just don't realise sometimes how we're not necessarily considering the full impact of how we do it. And so I think, that whole secret squirrel, it's a very popular argument, like you say, But it's a little bit frustrating, because would you rather have a government that is unconsciously framing choices badly to make it more difficult for you to do things that you're actually genuinely interested in and serve your self-purpose? Or would you like government to actually preserve your choice to do it or not do it, but make it easy for you to do it? It's a bit of a moot point, I think.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard it from the government person. We're doing it all the time anyway. Other comments?
Well, we set up whole agencies to do it. Big Health is trying to do this. Good on it.
No, we're implementing policy and practicing policy. We have been for the last however long governments have been going for, without actually thinking about these aspects of it. And they're kind of important.
I'm going to go to another question or comment from the audience. Oh, yes, here. Sorry, Anne, just down here.
Yep. Hello, so I'm Phillips from the Australian Council of State School Organisations. In my role, we're all about trying to influence policy to produce a better outcome. And it's a bit of a dance and it's a bit of a game, because the field that we work in is so highly complex and there are no absolute right or wrong answers. And so what advice can you give organisations such as us that are seeking to lobby and influence behind the scenes to create tangible change? Because the number of conversations we have, sometimes you feel you're going down blind alleys, and then occasionally you get a little bit of a win where you think the policy may have shifted subtly. And then it becomes part of a political bun fight. But in our role, we know we're seeing policy as our legacy. It's not media headlines. It's actually on the ground change. So any advice would be welcome.
Either of you? Nicholas?
I don't know. Have an ad campaign. Look, I don't know. You're asking me for advice on how to manipulate government, how to lobby. Most of it doesn't work, and some of it does. And the people with a lot of money go and badger the minister all the time. The minister's usually the wrong person to badger. You need to badger people at the right level who want to fix stuff up.
I was going to say, this is a tricky space, and I think government is a difficult institution. Like it just is. I think and there are people in government all over the place who are absolutely motivated by the same long-term impacts and drive for public value that many of the people outside government are motivated by. And the challenge is to find them and work together. And that's part of, that's not part of the behavioural insights approach. This is part of more of the broader, innovation thing about how do we collaborate more effectively across sectors to drive public value, and how does government start to acknowledge that we are part of an approach rather than the entire answer to any one thing.
But Sam, you were saying earlier that behavioural insights can help us understand ourselves.
Tell me.
So what can behavioural insights help us understand about the decision makers, the politicians themselves? Are there some learnings there about how we should approach our lobbying and advocacy? Any thoughts on that?
Look for ease, attractiveness, social and timely.
They're
quite honestly,
humans after all.
we are all humans.
I'll make another comment, which is that one of the things we're looking at here is the issues to do with a whole bunch of people out in the field who know stuff and how that gets funneled up to large decision makers. There are two areas where we have established bodies of expertise, if you like. Those are in health and education. We've built professions to deliver these things. And unfortunately, people at the top often don't take sufficient notice of them. It's quite an interesting thing to ask, should the head of the Department of Education be an ex-teacher or not? And there are arguments for and there are arguments against. Likewise, the person at the top of the health system. But it's quite interesting and worth keeping in mind that subsuming this sort of stuff under general headings of innovation has a lot there's plenty to be criticised.